Yes, so thanks for the introduction, Emily. My name is Jeremy Schuman. I'm a psychologist in St. Louis, Missouri, so near where Emily is too. And I am working at a place called the Center for Mindfulness and CBT. I mostly just do clinical work where I see patients. I used to be the director here, but I've stepped back from that to do more advocacy work. I work with IOCDF, the International OCD Foundation, and their special interest group for autism and OCD, where I'm trying to put out a lot of material to educate clinicians and researchers, as well as folks with OCD and their families, where I'm trying to bring the neurodiversity affirming perspective into the world of OCD. The world of OCD is very, very behavioral, and the world of neurodiversity is not very behavioral. Um, I sit in a little intersection between the two where I really feel protective of my clients who can be harmed by certain strategies, and at the same time, I find these behavioral techniques to be some of the most potent interventions that I have. And I don't want to guardrail people who can benefit from these kinds of interventions away. And so the work that I'm doing at IOCDF is to make it a safe place for folks who have been harmed by the medical model to show up and benefit from the knowledge from these medical folks there while being respected in the way that the neurodiversity community is going to expect them. So that was likely to be lifelong work for me, and it's been what I've really delved into for the past year. I also teach a seminar. I teach a trained therapists in how to do exposure and response prevention for OCD. And at my practice here, all the new folks who come through, we kind of have a little OCD specialty clinic. So they all have to come through my consultation groups, things like that. So I'm mostly doing clinical and advocacy work these days, along with a little bit of teaching. This particular talk is the culmination of several years of my thinking on this subject and several other topics that I've talked through with folks at IOCDF. And I think just around this year is where I've been able to consolidate it into something that bridges the two worlds, where it speaks to people from both backgrounds. But I can't tell you how excited I am to talk to an audience who already gets neurodiversity, and I'm not going to have to stick on a grievance versus a phenomenology-based understanding of autism for a million questions. So this is going to be fun for me, and I'm looking forward to getting into a lot of the detailed, nuanced conceptualization with a group who values that kind of stuff. So let's get into it. Oh, now I can't change slides. Let's see if this will work now. I think I'm going to have to stop screen. Oh, there we go. Now it's going to work. Great. Okay, so why do this talk? To start with, there's a huge amount of overlap between OCD and autism, with about 17% of autistic people meeting criteria for a diagnosis of OCD, which is much higher than the estimates for the general population. So we've got a large amount of people that get affected here. And further, there is harm that happens in this community of people when we poorly understand what's going on for them, because repetitive behaviors are common in both autism and in OCD. And when we misapply strategies that work for one condition to the other, we can cause harm. Um, so the confusing aspects are that these behaviors look the same, but there's also linked genetics and linked neurobiology. So even within the research community, the lines between these various forms of neurodiversity often looks very fuzzy, and autism OCD is no exception for that. So what I've noticed is that rather than siloing these two conditions into separate camps where we treat one or treat the other, being able to conceptualize how they interplay with each other has been really, really valuable for my clients for a number of reasons that we're going to talk about. And I use this word catalyzing. By catalyzing, I'm talking about like a chemical equation where if we have two things reacting with each other, we can add a catalyst to the test tube, and that reaction happens more efficiently. So by catalyzing, I say autism can catalyze OCD. I don't mean that autism causes OCD. These are distinct things. But OCD might have these little nooks and crannies that it creeps into places of confusion and uncertainty in people's lives. And there are some really common pockets that come from autistic experiences, both the traits themselves as well as the invalidation about the experience of those traits. So understanding how that process of catalyzing has worked has been really valuable to my clients. And if we get good at understanding that interplay, then our conceptualizations are going to become much better. It's going to allow us to be better clinicians. It's going to allow us to be more ethical in the way that we do things. And it's going to make the work interesting and fun and exciting and empowering for people. Um, so this stuff can sometimes feel like the not the mechanism of action of the OCD treatment. When we're talking about behavioral therapy, there's a tendency to want to discard anything that gets into, I want to deeply understand, and instead just go for what's the most parsimonious way to make this treatment effective. I've really valued taking my time with conceptualizing so that I can move away from just pushing that kind of efficiency, instead get all these benefits that come from that nuanced understanding. So there are three parts to the talk that I'm going to give today. First, we're going to talk about how autism can catalyze obsession and compulsion. And then I'm going to talk about something that I bet a lot of you are already familiar with, where when it comes to doing behavioral therapy or CBT therapy, that we can cause harm to our clients if all we care about are these outcomes where we're measuring how compliant was the person that I'm treating. Did I get them to do what I expect from them? So we're just going to review that compliance is not an outcome that we're looking for here. And then we're going to move into how do I use these interventions for the benefit of my clients so that it's not just how do I think about this, what's the insight, but how do I use these insights in clinical practice? So first, how does autism catalyze OCD? Again, OCD and autism both feature repetitive behaviors. And because these similar behaviors are observed, they get confused. So we get a lot of people who are autistic get being told that their repetition is based off of OCD, which is not true. And then we see sometimes folks who are autistic not getting an appropriate OCD diagnosis because we're explaining the repetitive behaviors as well. They're always in this sort of distress and not looking at deeper causes. But there's a difference in function between the repetitive behaviors associated with each diagnosis that differentiates why the folks are doing the repetitive behaviors, how they work. In OCD, these repetitive behaviors are compulsions. Folks get an intrusive thought, an obsession. It's really distressing. And so they do a compulsion trying to neutralize that distress or block that obsession from their mind. And these compulsions are kind of distressing to perform. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't have these intrusive thoughts coming in. So they're often very ego dystonic. I don't want to be doing this, but I need to keep myself safe. And it feels like it's taking too much of my time. In contrast, what we might call restrictive repetitive behaviors or RRBs that we see in autism, they're pleasant for the autistic person. They are identity affirming and they're effective in regulating arousal. Whereas compulsions make OCD worse over time, effectively learning how to stim and engage with your special interests. These are things that can look repetitive on the outside, but they'll help you manage your arousal over the long term and increase your quality of life and functioning and reduce your distress. So we have to be aware of what these different functions are because trying to do an intervention on a restricted repetitive behavior that was designed for a compulsion is going to take the person away from the effective coping strategy that they had. And so it's just not it's gonna harm the person through that. And further, it's just unlikely to work because the mechanism of action behind exposure therapy isn't what is helping folks who are autistic who are stimming. They're not going to get any benefit out of that. So difference in function leads to difference in treatment response. So my big call to action throughout my career, but in this presentation, it's that when we conceptualize clients, we're doing it not in a cursory surface level way, but we're taking the time to really understand why they do the things they do, what it is internally like for them, subjectively like for them. And this difference in approach to assessment or conceptualization, we can use these $20 words that we probably touched on in grad school of nomothetic and ideographic to understand them better. Nomothetic means I'm trying to do this research or conceptualization that is relevant to a general population. How can I extend what I know about this person to other people, or how can I use what I know about other people to apply to this person? It's more objective, it's more generalizable, it lets you do all these predictions. When I'm looking for what kind of evidence-based therapy do I want to use first line for this client, being able to understand, oh, this is how they look like other clients, and this is what the research says supports other clients who look like this. That's a nomothetic approach that holds a lot of value for me. That's how I do evidence-based practice. But once I get an idea of that, I'm going to go deeper. And I'm going to move on to the other side of the coin, which is more of an ideographic assessment and conceptualization. Ideographic, like idiosyncratic, we're describing on an individual level. It's very subjective, it's very contextual, it's really relevant to the individual and not able to extend outwards. Researchers don't love this kind of work because who wants to publish it? How is it useful to a broader population? But to the individual that you're serving, it's incredibly useful. So that's why I push for a lot in clinical work. So let's talk about how these conceptualizations work. This is a basic model of OCD. Folks get folks experience some trigger. They're in the world and they see something that they associate with their fear, or they're in their head and their chain of associations takes them to a thought that reminds them of these associations, and they get an intrusive thought. This is really key to OCD. Our obsessions are experienced as these intrusions and sticky cognitive experiences. These thoughts are sometimes they're language, like words in the thoughts, sometimes they're images, sometimes they're urges, but they feel intrusive and they cause a lot of distress because they are ego dystonic. They don't agree with who we think that we are as a person. But those sorts of intrusive thoughts, they're not that rare. Brains think of a lot of things divergently. And just because we have a thought doesn't mean we're going to invest in it at all. But people with OCD, when they experience these intrusions, they misappraise the meaning of that intrusive thought to think this means something about me. If I had a thought about someone being harmed, does this mean that I want that person to be harmed? Does that mean I can cause that harm? If I have a thought that something is contaminated, do I take that seriously versus recognizing that was a passing thought and there was no connection to reality with it? And taking those thoughts seriously, misappraising leads to these negative emotions. That's often fear, but OCD is not an anxiety disorder. It's a obsessive compulsive disorder. The fear comes somewhat downstream from realizing, oh my gosh, this obsession has told me that I'm dangerous or I'm in some sort of danger or the world isn't what I thought it was. And so we feel that aversive emotion. That downstream fear could also, instead of being fear, it might be disgust, it might be shame, it can be, they're just intense aversive experiences. And then folks do a coping behavior because they're feeling this amount of intense negative experience. And we get these two feedback loops where the compulsive coping behavior reduces the aversive emotion, which then negatively reinforces, I got to do more of this coping behavior. And eventually it can become very detached from anything functional. And I'm just doing it because I get intrusive thoughts. This makes me feel bad. Hopefully doing this behavior makes that feeling go away, but it's kind of lost touch with the obsession itself. Sometimes, though, we take this other pathway. The compulsive behaviors are allowing folks to avoid the situations that would prove their misappraisal wrong. That if folks face the situations that they were assuming to be dangerous or too disgusting or too shameful, that they'll learn if they sit with that, that, oh, these bad things didn't really happen, or I could tolerate these thoughts or feelings much more than I thought, or it didn't stick around in my brain as long as I anticipated, it didn't ruin my life in the way that I thought it would. And so we get more of that operant conditioning this way, where I don't get the learning experiences to undo the development of that obsession because of the compulsive coping behaviors. So, basic cognitive behavioral model of OCD. When I say that autism can catalyze OCD, I'm trying to add in to this model when we have that co-occurrence. So it might look something like this, that sensory differences and interoceptive differences and difference in cognition, emotional intensity, executive function difficulty, they all become reasons that people would misappraise what's going on in their intrusive thoughts. And I'm going to cover the specifics of why that. And then additionally, things like monotropism, preference for sameness, hyperfocus, special interest, bottom-up processing, this pushback against hierarchy with this demand for autonomy. These are all reasons that people would be rigid in the way that they perform behaviors, which can lead to that compulsive part of it. Understanding when the pieces of that OCD puzzle are being influenced by these autistic traits, we can more clearly design what are the interventions that we want to use, what are the learning tasks that are going to help our client to get into the specifics of why they're going this direction, why their behaviors have been maintained, what the function of them really are, and move away from simplistic understanding like you just can't tolerate distress. So you guys are probably already familiar with this general idea, and I won't have to cover it as long, but on the left here, we have the DSM-5's version of autism in an abridged format where we've got deficits in social communication interaction and RRBs. And then on the right here, we have a model from psychologist in Tennessee, Matt Lowry, that describes traits of autistic people that we might think of as underlying some of these observable behaviors that other people have grievances about. And there's lots of good trainings about understanding trait-based models of autism out there already. But I just like to point out things like um, we could call the social difficulty with autism a deficit in reciprocity, or we could say, I have a preference for learning a lot of information when I'm listening. I don't need to interrupt and ask a million questions. I'm not trying to form a connection with this person based off of just back and forth. We're not stepping on each other's toes. I'm trying to form a connection with this person based off the content of what they're saying. Or I have a lot that I want to say, and I feel appreciated when someone is going to listen to all this content. Is that a deficit in reciprocity, or is that a difference in preference of how folks connect? And we can look at each of these criteria and say there are traits that underlie these grievances that could lead people to say the autistic person has a problem when a reality is the autistic person is doing these behaviors for a reason that makes sense with their profile of traits, the way that they experience the world. So, to be clear, as we look at these autistic traits, some of them look like colloquial ways that people understand OCD. So, for example, self-stimming stims, these are positive sensory input meant to regulate hyper and hypoarousal, but they can be confused with compulsive touching or ritual movement that's meant to prevent some sort of disaster, or doing something that feels like it's neutralizing a thought in our mind. But we ask the function and then we trust our client, and stims are not OCD. They're not compulsive. Same with special interest. This is a very colloquial understanding to think that obsession means hyperfixation, the way that we say obsessed. Oh, I'm so obsessed with Star Wars. But that is not, I'm having intrusive, aversive experiences around Star Wars. That's, I enjoy it. So, special interest, hyperfixation. This is a valuable tool. This is not compulsive engagement or obsession. They're different things. And sensory sensitivity, this is not obsession either, even if folks may have extreme reactions and are avoidant of sensory things without an autism diagnosis, because this sensory sensitivity goes across profiles, right? It's part of ADHD as well for many people. And if you read the text of OCD, it's in the text of the DSM about the OCD, about OCD, even though it's not in the criteria. So the sensory phenomena are not symptoms of OCD, although it can underlie some of the obsession in some ways. We'll show that in a second. Uh, but so ERP or our strategies for working on OCD are not going to work with these. Further, I should add on that body focused repetitive behaviors like skin picking and hair pulling, those are repetitive behaviors that are not OCD. And tic disorders, these are repetitive behaviors that are not OCD as well. So if we looked at that trait model of autism very briefly, I've been trying to describe a trait model of what are the underlying neurological patterns, what's your profile of traits that leads people towards developing OCD or having people complain that you're being too repetitive based around these obsessions. And so there's a lot of overlap between the traits that are in my description here and the autism model from before. But I want to cover a couple of these points to understand some of this overlap. So one way that folks might develop OCD is when they're processing of reality, when they are thinking and they're imagining things in their mind, they have highly sensory ways of experiencing that internally. There's a scale from hypophantasia, where I really can't picture things in my mind, to hyperphantasia, where I get very detailed visualization. And this is a trait that it's not it's not that all autistic people are hyper or hypo, or all OCD or all folks with OCD are hyper or hypo. It's just distributed as a form of neurodiversity throughout our population. But folks who are highly sensory in the way they experience the world, the way they experience their imagination of the world, they're more likely to say, what's the meaning of this thought? Why did I experience it in such an intense way? There's got to be something behind that. The next one is that these sticky thoughts, where the thought keeps returning, kind of feels like premonitory urges, or it feels like what people with Tourette's or tic disorders describe. And there's a lot of shared neurobiology where basal ganglia is causing this looping pattern in the brain. And people with OCD are describing this feeling of the obsession returning a lot like a mental tic. And so some folks are going to be more highly expressed in that, where they get a lot of even neutral obsessions and their thoughts tick back to the same thing over and over and over again, or they go to hyper awareness in their body where their attention keeps going back to the same thing over and over and over again. Whereas some folks might have that experience a little bit less, and they have more of the other pieces of this puzzle. The next one would be these urges. Sometimes these urges might have some basis in, again, that tic disorder type presentation, where in OCD we want to say that that these ego dystonic obsessions that we have is not who you are, it's not what you want to do. But people say, I have an urge to do this, and the common response might be, no, you're just doubting whether or not you want to do that. That's not a real urge. But within tic disorders, we see there's a number of people who do get urges. They get urges to stick a fork in a light socket, for example, or to blurt something out at a meeting. And those potentially aversive consequences lead to increased urgency. And that feels a lot like what people with OCD are describing when they say, do I want to punch someone on the street or do I want to say a racial slur in this business meeting that I have? Next would be dissociation. This is pretty common amongst autistic folks, and it's distributed throughout the population. Obviously, it's really common in trauma. Folks can end up in obsession when they spend a lot of time disconnected from the reality in the here and now, up in their brain in imaginal absorption, one form of dissociation. And they will come up with these narratives that justify compulsion. Those narratives really are at the heart of the obsessional beliefs. So proneness to dissociation also can lead to proneness to OCD. Emotional intensity. We see this common in autistic folks who have hyper empathy or this rule following hyper scrupulosity, but it's also super common in OCD to see folks unable to tolerate their feeling of empathy when they see suffering in others and feeling responsible for everyone else to be safe. So that amount of intense distress can lead you to wonder, am I doing something wrong? Have I done enough? Is something awful happening here that other people seem to be fine with, but I'm having a big emotional reaction? Now people will change their way of thinking to match their reaction through some emotional reasoning there. Bottom-up processing, really common amongst autistic people, really common also for OCD folks as well, that where experience is understood through sensation and emotion instead of first thinking about it, can lead us into compulsive behaviors because it's sort of this primal, this happened, so I have to do this. And I didn't really filter it through a lot of logic. It just made sense to me on that emotional level. Sensory sensitivity can lead to obsessive beliefs. Think about if you were in a classroom and there was an extremely strong smell that, like of formaldehyde in a biology classroom, and everyone else seems to be focusing just fine, but you're unable to focus. Uh, and everyone is resistant, saying, we don't need to change anything about this classroom. It's absolutely fine. But you're feeling like I'm breathing in chemicals all the time. It'd be very easy to come up with an explanation. I can't breathe in these chemicals because they're dangerous. I smell it strong. No one else is taking me seriously. I need to protect myself now, not just from an annoyance or a sensory overwhelm, even, but from real danger. Like this will cause me cancer if I keep breathing it in long enough. Disgust hypersensitivity is maybe a specific sort of sensory sensitivity where the subjective experience of disgust is just more intense. And folks who have kids who have had to change diapers might have noticed that one parent gets more grossed out by the diapers than the other and doesn't have as easy of a time cleaning up the mess. Um, that is pretty innate, and it habituates very slowly. It desensitizes very slowly and incompletely. It doesn't go away when we keep facing disgust over and over and over again. And we can see that with any parent who's had to clean a million diapers. Um, but it can lead again towards the OCD narrative through my experience of disgust being so intense justifies why I do need to avoid this. Maybe it really is dangerous. Maybe it really is something that is worse than what I would normally see. I'll give an example because you might have a little bit less like OCD folks in the room for this. It's a therapist who's put this out. Her name is Amanda Petrick Gardner, and she's a wonderful OCD therapist. She has lived experience with OCD, and she described that her dad, when she was a kid, would have to go into the crawl space of the house or would have to fiddle with something under the sink. And she thought that those things were very gross. You know, there's spider webs and dust and maybe a little bit of mold under the sink or something like that. And so it made her feel upset as a kid. And then now she's the adult, she's a mom. Her kid drops something down the HVAC register, a toy, and says, Mom, can you reach down there and reach it and pull it out? And she's reduced to tears because she can't imagine sticking her hand down there. And it's so overwhelming to her. But when she sees that, she works on her OCD about this, she sees that the narrative about what is disgusting down there comes from these assumptions that she had when she's a kid. And if she looks down there in real life, there's a couple cobwebs, maybe there's a couple dust bunnies, but in her mind was her worst nightmare, and the reality of it is not what it was. So when she could see that, well, now I don't have a disgust reaction to a couple dust bunnies. I was having a disgust reaction to all these associations with what goes on in the crawl spaces of houses. Now, contrast that to someone who's got to swim in a public swimming pool and they see a Band-Aid floating in the swimming pool, they may resolve their OCD that they're going to get a staph infection that's going to put them in the hospital, and their family is going to say, "Why did they get in the swimming pool? We needed them." They might be able to resolve that part, but they still, if they have this disgust sensitivity, might look at that water and say, "I see the film of sunscreen over the top, even though I don't think that there's dangerous germs in there. I'm still disgusted by that experience." And so that might be something that leads people into their obsession and something that we might have to work with separately than just the disgust obsession. NJREs are another sort of neuro trait where that stands for not just right experiences. And this is so core to most presentations of OCD, where I do something and it should have been good enough, but I don't get the feeling that everything is right. So I need to repeat it, and I'll come up with special rules or numbers or ways or rituals to try to get it to feel right, even though logically I say, doesn't really make sense, but I need it to feel like it's right. If there is one central kind of neurodivergence that is OCD, if we're going to say OCD is neurodivergence, likely I would want to point to these not just right experiences as something that folks with OCD are experiencing on that neurological level. Then also preference for sameness, folks who like to do things the same way all the time, as we see in our autistic folks, monotropic folks. uh, they're going to be more likely to find their way into the repetitive patterns because I need to do it. I like doing it this way. Turns into I need to do it this way. Turns into if I don't do it this way, some catastrophe will happen. And then finally, just general neuroticism. These are all things that can lead folks to say, why did I have that thought? Or I need to do it a specific way, or these thoughts mean something more than just what's happening on the surface. So here's some specific ways that that can show up. With sensory hyper and hyposensitivity, autism can catalyze OCD because these intense subjective experiences with sensory input create narratives about harm or disgust, like the formaldehyde story. Also, repetitive behaviors are less likely to be aversively extinguished if sensory response is muted. So these are our hyposensory folks, and they might do a repetitive behavior over and over again. And if they were experiencing that sensory feeling as intensely, they might say, "Oh, this hurts my hands to
Mm.
wash so many times." But, or my legs are getting tired doing all of this pacing. But with sort of a muted sensory experience, they might not get some of those aversive consequences that would cause them to be less repetitive to begin with.
Mm.
Also, stimming behaviors or motor stereotypies, which are sort of a form of stimming, can become associated with the obsessional narrative. So again, these things that start off as I'm overwhelmed in some sensory way. Putting in this positive sensory stimulation helps me stay regulated. And then over time, it goes from I want this to I need this to if I don't do it this specific way, something bad is going to happen. And folks who are prone to these NJREs, not just right experiences, can have that NJRE attached to the way they are stimming. And now we've got the overlap where I need to perform my stim just right to make the OCD happy, whereas the function of the stim to begin with was supposed to be helping me feel good, helping me feel better about some form of overwhelm that was going to work. So, oh boy, we got stuck in the middle there. But it can also be the sensory sensitivity can be confused with OCD. When people are inflexible about avoiding aversive sensory experiences, people can say, "You're just avoiding your obsession." That is not true. That is not helpful. Subjective distress with aversive sensory experiences really is universal. And we already have some amount of universal design in our society to make things comfortable. The way we agree on how we set the temperature in an office or what air fresheners are supposed to smell like. And they're not truly as universal as we might like them to be. If we acknowledge that we've all had experiences where we're uncomfortable in a sensory way because we went onto a bus that smelled like pee, or we were in a classroom that was too cold for us to concentrate, we can have more compassion for the inflexibility we see with folks who are autistic who are not showing any sort of like uh, maladaptive anxiety, but just real aversion. And people can be confused when they see folks who have motor stereotypies thinking that they're non-functional, they're not doing anything, and that it must just be to alleviate some sort of like internal intrusive thought that they're having. But there is a function to the motor stereotypies. Doing the repetitive thing over and over and over again in a predictable way is sending that input to the person that everything is safe, everything is fine, and it is helping them come down. So it is functional. It's not that maladaptive coping that we see in OCD. Within emotional differences, we could see autism catalyze OCD through this hyper and hypo empathy. Someone who has a ton of empathy, um, and especially when that empathy is not met by people around them, can become feel hyper responsible, feel like a overwhelm, like I need to block this emotion out of my head because I can't tolerate it. And that can lead to these narratives where I'm doing this now in a maladaptive way that doesn't really make sense because my empathy is going to stick around no matter what I try to do about it. Conversely, with this hypoempathy, or maybe I should say empathy that's unpredictable, where I wasn't empathetic about the thing you expected me to be empathetic about. I was highly empathetic about something you didn't expect. They can develop OCD because they might think, what, am I a psychopath? Why am I not having a strong reaction to this? What does it mean about my character? And they can start to doubt their sense of self, leading to obsessions about, am I capable of harm? Am I a bad person? Same with this justice sensitivity and honesty sensitivity. Um, justice sensitivity maybe is like an extension of hyper empathy in some ways, where we feel that personal responsibility for making the world a just place, even though we know that it's not fair. We're not going to get there. Or being reactive to dishonesty and feeling like I really need to clear something up. So that's a really common compulsion would be I need to um, confess anything that I've done wrong so that I can get reassurance from someone else that I'm not a bad person because I was doubting myself. Folks who have intense honesty sensitivity might misunderstand their place in the spectrum of honesty across the population when they're having these intense moments of honesty sensitivity around things like white lies or getting away with something when they're being a little bit mischievous. Uh, Meltdowns and shutdowns can be part of OCD, where people think that they're bad because of a meltdown. They trust themselves less because of it. Or it can be part of OCD in a way that maybe it's a little bit less fun to talk about, where if someone is facing their trigger for OCD and they're obsessing and they're not allowed to do their compulsions, they might be experiencing a lot of distress in that moment, and that might lead to overwhelm. And then they express the meltdown, and then their support system says, "What do I do about this?" And they want to accommodate the person's needs. But if they are accommodating the OCD, they know that they're going to make the obsession get worse. So it feels like the meltdown could be manipulation, but it's not manipulation. It's not a survival skill, even in that way. It's not like a learned survival skill. It is just literally a meltdown. It's literally being overwhelmed and losing control of that kind of inhibition of emotion. And um, yeah, but the confusion of could I hurt somebody? Or or other folks thinking, or I shouldn't say the confusion yet. The the way autistic folks can get their way with OCD because they're showing that they're having a meltdown because it's so overwhelming to their sensory system or their emotional system. Um, and then also emotional difference. We often see this like intense attachment or jealousy or grief emotions. These are some of the uncommon emotions that people think people who are autistic have more of a flat affect or less emotional. And then we see these intense grief experiences or intense jealousy or intense limerence for someone and say, I guess it's just more unpredictable. But that intensity of emotion can also go into obsessional stories about why I'm feeling this intensity. It's because something is happening that is so awful. And we can see then relationship OCD show up or a lot of compulsive reassurance seeking coming up because of the intensity of the need there. But it's not the same as OCD in all cases because we certainly see people who are hyper scrupulous, hyper responsible, rule followers, but they're not OCD. They just really love the predictability of it and it feels very just for them. Um, and we saw that sometimes people are overwhelmed and we say, oh, you're afraid when there's just actually a reasonable reason for them to be overwhelmed. See that a lot with political stuff right now, where some people are having big emotional reactions. And then the response is, oh, you have an anxiety disorder in response to something. And sometimes the answer is really, no, there's serious changes that are happening to my life right now that are going to be harmful. This is not just fear-based distress. This is adaptive fear and anxiety. And we already covered how it could be seen as manipulation when it's just truly a meltdown. And sometimes that limerence or intense, you're my special interest, but you're a person, that can be confused for relationship OCD when it's really not. It's a hyperfixation. Interoceptive differences, we can see that sometimes the autistic people experience interoception as either really vague and subtle or intense. And so these vague or intense experiences of internal states lead to confusion and distrust of identity and self. So, an example of that could be, do I feel attraction to this person? If I have sort of a vague feeling of sexuality to begin with, then I could easily get confused about how would I know if I was attracted to this person or not? And if I have intense interoceptive experiences, for example, pain feels really intense for me, then I could wake up with a stiff neck and think, do I have meningitis? I don't want to move my neck because things are going to get much worse over the course of the day and get trapped in doubt about not being able to understand what's going on with their experience. We could also see this with like hypersensitivity to emotion. So in the last slide, I was talking about difference in emotional reaction, but difference in experiencing the intensity of emotion. When I feel disgust at 10 out of 10, it could send me a signal. This really is a dangerous or a too disgusting stimulus for anyone to deal with. Um, and I might lose touch with what my actual tolerance for something is because at first blush, it felt really intense, and I never spent the time to see what else is this going to look like when I sit with it. Um, we covered hyperresponsiveness to pain and discomfort. And then even things like differences in noticing your body's cues to have to use the bathroom or eat or rest. These can lead to obsessions where I sit on the toilet for an hour because I don't feel like I'm totally empty. And my teacher is saying, come back to class. You can try again during the next period. But I can't tell what I'm feeling. And so I can develop obsessions around why maybe I need to sit on the toilet because I'm going to have an accident if I walk away from it right now. But those things are not the same as these traits within autism as just general alexithymia, not being able to put words to your emotions and intense emotions. Those are not OCD. Having true chronic pain or having a hypersensitivity to chronic pain, it's not the same thing as OCD, although we could develop OCD about it. Um, Hyperawareness, OCD, illness, anxiety disorder, factitious symptoms, these could also look like autistic traits where someone is too ruminative or they're very much in their body. But these things are separate. Hyper-awareness OCD is more like that. My mind keeps ticking back to that sensation like that mental tick. So that is OCD and not autism. And we said poor interception of appetite could be mistaken for food aversion and or like ARFID, which is in the obsessive compulsive category. And executive function differences, inertia, hyperfocus, monotropism, these catalyze OCD through preference for sameness, through doing things in a repetitive way until it becomes compulsive. Um, And then the other side of those executive functioning differences is folks who struggle with planning and organizing and time management or response inhibition, just as a few examples, they struggle. Um, they might benefit from keeping a routine. And by doing that routine over and over and over again, we can justify, I need this routine. It's not just something that helps me with my executive function, but it's something that I need to survive. And we can come up with all sorts of stories about why that would happen. Further, the flip side of that is when I struggle with planning and organizing and time management and such, I've experienced a lot of criticism to myself about my ability levels. And I might know what I'm capable of, but I've been told over and over again that I'm lazy, that I can't get things done, that I'm not pleasant to work with. And that can lead to obsessions that I'm a bad person, I'm immoral, I'm doing this stuff on purpose, I'm lazy, etc. It could be confused with OCD, where compulsions interfering with efficiency. Um, so folks who have OCD will take a long time to do something because they're doing compulsions. Folks who don't have OCD, who have poor executive function, take a long time to do something. If you're an OCD clinician and you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail, you could look at someone's poor executive functioning and say, you're doing things ritualistically as opposed to this is the routine that's helped me figure out a way to like be efficient to the best of my ability. Those routines might seem non-functional from the outside, but to the person who spent a lot of time and effort designing it for themselves or finding those patterns, they could tell you what the function is. We could also see obsessional slowness, where sometimes people who are slow processors, they might be called out for having OCD because they say, you're rehearsing something in your mind before you're talking, or you're moving so slowly so that you can be aware of every moment, when really it's more of a processing speed issue. Or we could see, I didn't follow through on my homework, or I came late to my appointment, as defensiveness against treatment or a treatment interfering behavior, the way we call TIBS in DBT, when it was really just an executive function issue and no amount of motivation would allow me to overcome that difficulty. Within cognitive differences that we see, autistic people experience their thoughts on a spectrum, and uh, there are a bunch of different qualia, meaning these internal subjective experiences that you can't really communicate to other people with words, that autistic people will describe as being kind of different. So an example of qualia is, if I picture the sky being blue, I have a version of blue in my mind, but if I ask someone else what color is the sky, they say blue. In their internal picture, how do I know that they see the same blue that I do? How do I know that the light from the sky hitting the rods and cones in my eyes creates the same imagined experience for me as it does for someone else? And talking with autistic people, we hear things about thought, like my thought was really in the form of pictures. I don't have an internal monologue. Again, that's not unique to autistic people, but we see divergent cognition more commonly in this group of people. Or my thoughts are racing all the time, or I have four streams of thought going at the same time, or sometimes thoughts jump out at me like a surprise and I wasn't expecting them, and there I can be startled by my own mind. Um, Add into that the bottom-up processing, where autistic folks can have a tendency to go based off of their associations and emotional reaction as opposed to their logic and what they're thinking about things. You have this subjective internal experience that creates an emotional response for you, and you go based off of that, this is just fuel for doing things to like make myself feel better as opposed to for doing things because it's really going to affect the outside world. It's going to actually make me safer. So we could see how having confusing qualia and bottom-up processing could also lead toward that compulsion. And a cognitive difference, like just uh, tendency towards dissociation, having a mind that wanders, can lead to those sorts of obsessions as well. But we can get confusion with OCD, where not all emotional reasoning is OCD, not all daydreaming and rumination is OCD. I describe this for how autism leads to obsession and compulsion, but this catalyzing process is not unique to autism. There is a psychology of how obsessions get developed and how compulsions get reinforced that goes beyond just neurobiology, and the experiences within these groups can contribute to that, as can any sort of life experience. You do not have to have one of these conditions. If you were walking home from school singing to yourself, step on a crack, break your mother's back, and you stepped on a crack, and then you got home and your mom had a broken back, that kind of learning experience also can, get into the nooks and crannies, can be what determines what your OCD takes shape as. Okay. So that's all of part one. I'm going to just briefly touch on part two and spend more time on part three. We all know these guys. The problem with pounding a square peg into a round hole isn't that hammering is hard work, it's that you're destroying the peg.
Mm.
Folks, especially in the OCD world, don't want to work with autism because they feel like it's so hard to get them to do what I want them to do. But the reason for that is because they are causing harm and they are not open to that kind of feedback. And so I think that it is sort of an ethical responsibility for folks to get educated about traits that underlie autism, ADHD, neurodivergence in general, and be able to do way better conceptualization than just blame their patients for being difficult. Within the OCD world, we are currently dealing with a problem of epistemic injustice. I'm going to give credit for this image to Rit Rajarshi, and I just pulled it off of Wikipedia, but he's got a license to use it for free. We've got our autistic person in red here, and we've got our clinician in brown here. An autistic person is holding idea A in their head, and clinician is holding that autistic person in their head and trying to make a mental representation of what's in the autistic person's head, but they don't have the language, the concepts, the experience to understand. So the advice that they're giving, the interventions they're doing might be well-meaning, but they are looking for outcomes in a way that fundamentally misunderstood the complaints to begin with. We end up with this problem of injustice when we cannot take autistic people's subjective experience and understanding and bring it back to them in helpful ways. So affirming outcomes instead of compliance are going to be when we end obsession, we resolve obsession, and I move on past this and I don't feel the distress anymore. It's when with disgust, I'm not just being flexible about disgust, but I actually did desensitize to the experience of disgust. And when I'm challenging my avoidance of things, I'm feeling a sense of mastery that I enjoy these things now and I feel competent and capable in these situations, not I'm forced. There's always going to be a balance of flexibility and negotiation where I have to face disgusting things, for example, to work at my job. And I'm going to ask for some accommodations. But if I try to completely avoid these things, my coworkers aren't completely avoiding everything that's distressing to them. And I want a place in this world. It may not be fair to me, but my goals understand that I'm not completely dismantling ableism in every system that I'm in. And so our goal as a therapist then becomes to teach people how to negotiate so that they can get accommodations and get their needs met, while also becoming flexible in ways where they have control over it. They have full agency over the decision to be flexible and the ability to set boundaries as much as possible so they don't have to. But sometimes what I want on the world is on the other side of me having to be flexible, and that can be okay too. When this slide in other talks, I'm reusing this from a talk I gave at IOCDF this week. So this slide in other talks says community trauma at the hands of behaviorists. This is my muted version of it, my toned down version of it for the IOCDF audience. But we don't want with our interventions to ever think that if you do this exposure for OCD, it's going to fundamentally change who you are as a person. You're not going to hold these values. You're not going to have these preferences. You're not going to have these sensitivities. That just, it doesn't work. It doesn't happen. When we try to do it, we're causing harm. Behaviorism causes harm when we are coercive, when we say, you have to do this. We can make it even harder by saying, there are certain things that you need to feel okay. And that, there's things like food, water, shelter. But for our autistic clients, it's also things like access to my stims that allow me to regulate so my body feels okay, and access to my special interests so that I have an identity and I have quality of life in the world. And if we are restricting access to what people need to feel okay in the world, contingent upon them doing a compliance behavior, then that kind of coercion is not teaching the message that I want to get across to people, where they are flexibly approaching things that they used to fear because they have a sense that they can overcome it. This is just, I don't have any choice. My back is against the wall and I guess I have to do it. Coercion extends even further into the concepts within behaviorism of like reinforcement, because in our neurodiversity world, we steer away from using positive reinforcement for behaviors we want to see from people. We assume people do well when they can. People want to do well, so they do well when they can. We need to give them the supports that they need where they will be able to do well. Whereas in the OCD world, you need to do your ERP homework, and so you get a token when you do it, or you get a piece of candy when you do it. You get a reward when you do it. That's going to be the most common advice. I try to take a middle tack against this, or in between these two extremes, where I think that there is a role for reinforcement in this work because it's hard work and reinforcement is pleasant. I'm writing my progress notes. I got candy next to me because I'm reinforcing myself for doing the work. Um, and I use the lab rat analogy, where if I'm trying to get a rat to press a lever in a cage and I put it in the cage, I want it to go sniffing around. First, you have to starve the rat. Otherwise, it doesn't have any motivation to go sniffing around to begin with. If I put a big pile of food in the middle of the cage, the rat doesn't care about the bar. It's going to eat that. Well, people are not rats. I don't know that we should treat rats that way either, but people are not rats, and I'm not okay with treating people like you don't have access to food and you're going to starve to death unless you start doing what I expect from you. But I see a big difference between you got all the food that you need to survive, but if you learn to press the button, you're going to get a glazed donut. Well, I don't need the glazed donut to survive, but it's pleasant, and I'm willing to work towards goals that are like above and beyond that, and that doesn't feel so bad to me. Although there's arguments about grooming, that's for another conversation. That's my behaviorism talk. And then lastly, our goal with behaviorism can't be just to see the extinguishing of the behavior that we like, because it could very easily be learned helplessness. We want to see that the reason the person stopped doing the compulsion was that they realized that their obsession was false and they didn't want to do the compulsion anymore. And that might come through resisting doing the compulsion to get the learning experiences. But in the long run, what they've achieved is now they know different. And so they want to do different. But there's another way that we can get there. If people learn, no matter how I explain it, how I try to advocate for myself, there is no way for me to exist in this world feeling okay. I guess I have to just not feel okay then, so everyone else can feel okay. And I assume that I'm helpless, and I'm not allowed to feel okay. And yeah, that's never the outcome. clinicians and parents will leverage things like attachment, where I'm disappointed that you didn't do this, and I'm proud of you for doing this, and you don't get my positive regard unless you do compliance behaviors. You could see how people will grow up thinking, I'm not acceptable, I'm not okay, this is all my fault, so I'm supposed to just accept the distress. That is not what we're going for. So, how do we use conceptualization as intervention here? First, just generally, within OCD, what works? Exposure and response prevention is our gold standard treatment. When it's real OCD, exposure response prevention helps about 60% of people, and it takes their Y box or Yale Brown obsessive compulsive score down by 35%. It does not guarantee them remission. So 60% of people get that significant reduction in symptoms, but it's not a cure for everyone. And we also have inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a bit newer in the United States. It is a cognitive-only intervention. There's no behavioral component to it. We don't have any research that supports using ICBT with autistic people with OCD, but I've used it a ton anyway. And I don't use it for every client for every reason, but it's a non-behavioral option that we have that can be effective. There is a woman who's got a practice in Maryland. Her name is Brittany Goff, and she does a lot of work in this area where she's talked about adapting ICBT and using ICBT with neurodivergent clients. Truthfully, she and I don't agree about everything, but she's put more labor into this and put out more work than anyone else. So I do encourage people to go check out all the great content that she has created. We also have acceptance and commitment therapy that is evidence-based for OCD, although it maybe doesn't have the level of support where it's going to reach that empirically supported treatment with the APA yet. So generally within these strategies, we're trying to use experience to correct misappraisal. We're trying to see obsessional logic and learn to resist the urge to head down that path. We can't argue our way out of an obsession. By the time we are in the obsession, we're lost. But we can learn how we construct obsessions, and we can stay grounded in the here and now and resist the siren's call to go start thinking our way down the rabbit hole where we're going to get lost and not pull out. So we can't argue our way out, but we can stop ourselves from arguing our way in. That involves a commitment to non-engagement. When I get intrusive thoughts, I have to treat it like, oh, well, this is just a thought. Doesn't matter that I had it. It doesn't need a reaction. The only thing I need to treat this thought with is patience. I don't have to do anything about it. My attention is on the world, not just the experience going on in my mind. And I have to commit to that where I get a scary thought and I don't dig in and explain to myself why I don't have to be afraid. I just know what it is and just leave it on the back burner without thinking about it till it goes away on its own. And we can't accommodate compulsions with OCD. When we accommodate compulsions as a therapist or as someone who's supporting our OCD loved one or person, we uh, we first of all we're just like further reinforcing, yes, you need this compulsion. We're also subtly agreeing with the obsession, and that's going to give them more evidence. See, this is the way that the world works. So people get worse, not just they don't get better when we accommodate their compulsions, they get worse because we are aligning with their OCD against the person when we're accommodating. Now, you guys already will know that that is so backwards for what we have to do for people who have sensory sensitivity or who need to do stimming or who they get overwhelmed in certain situations and want to have access to the same environments as everyone else. We need to do accommodation. So, oh, we got a big strategic difference there. In autism, what do we want to do? We want to build positive identity, create more quality of life through connecting people to what's authentic to them. Their quality of life is going to feel so much better when they're authentic. We're going to help them create accommodations that allow access to people of all ability levels and all support needs to every place that people want to go. That's how we can best support people with needs related to autism. We'll teach them to be assertive and self-advocate and challenge their own internalized ableism as they go through that process. And they're going to have to monitor their own overload and burnout, practice interoception, where some natural ability might have been protective against those things, but they need to train it so that they can advocate for themselves and build their own personal repertoire of what works to keep me regulated. What stims do I need? What sensory things help me out? How much time can I spend in overwhelming situations, etc. And then I put at the end here, yeah, and autistic people also can work on building tolerance and flexibility, just like allistic and neurotypical people can work on building tolerance and flexibility for autistic people. When we get these two things together, what can we do? Build a profile of their traits. They come in and they want a diagnosis, but I don't stop there. We describe these traits from Matt Lowry's model, but that's not the only model. I love the Montero interview. I will go through those. Uh, the output, the results section of that divvies up some specific areas that you could describe autistic traits. There's an interview called The Sassy. I forget who made that one. Um, Sunny Jane Wise has put out another neurodiverse traits. Uh, handout. I have these conversations with people sort of casually, and then usually what I'm doing is we're having a conversation, and I got a Word doc open or a Google Doc open in the other screen, and I'm typing down. Anytime we hit on something, I'm typing down a quote of theirs, I'm typing down some of their language, and then I'm sending that back to them to put together their own profile, make a creative project out of it, or write something about it, or just have for notes if they want. Um, when they learn these new pieces of language and new concepts, they will be able to self-advocate better. We will be able to get on the same wavelength for communication. We'll be able to work through some of that epistemic injustice and avoid that problem. When they know the profile of traits, then I'm teaching clients to ask themselves about the function of their behaviors. At the end of the day, the client is going to be the expert of, is this a compulsion or an RRB? So they're going to have to tell us why they're doing what they're doing. And we're not going to always be around to help them walk through that process. So I teach them the idea of what function means, what functional assessment is, how to do this for themselves, and how to tell other people what the function is. I'll help them look at other patterns to build insight in that, but we spend a bunch of time on that. At about this point, I often get, so everyone needs to be more accommodating to me because of all these autistic traits. And I don't think I'm really having too many demands at all with OCD. And this is where I start to say, so why are you in therapy with me? And orienting them back towards ego dystonic aspects of OCD, where we start to say, I can't tell the difference. Why did you seek treatment in the first place? Where are and explaining what this concept of ego dystonic is and kind of reflecting back to them some of their own language that they're using towards you that justifies their behavior so that they're saying, well, no, I don't think I need to be doing it this way. And that's how I can start to separate some of those pieces apart when they're arguing back to me, no, this is why I'm saying that's OCD. So that is a motivational interviewing, or it's good counseling skill in general to be able to flip that and have them start to talk about what's ego dystonic instead of arguing with them. A big way that I build that alliance to be able to do that, and I'm sure all you guys are trying to do this with your clients already too, find out where they are right and agree with them to reduce defensiveness because people with repetitive behaviors are getting criticized a lot. So find out where they are right, where you can agree with them, where you can not just validate, yeah, it's valid to have those experiences, but you can justify, I think if I was in your shoes, I would have done the exact same thing. That will help build that alliance. And now we're not arguing back and forth about things. Then they can be the guide. We can remember no one wants to be overrun by OCD in this way. So they can be the guide. People with OCD develop a fundamental distrust of themselves. They think, I can't tell what's happening here. I can't trust myself to not lose control. We want to help people reestablish a sense of trust in themselves. So agreeing with them, finding where they're right, reinforcing it, stepping out of the expert role and telling them they can trust themselves over and over again is a really helpful part of this treatment when that intersection is leading to the OCD and the invalidation is leading to the OCD. So We will help conceptualize our clients, and they will use that conceptualization in the moment to make the decision whether they're going to accommodate or they're going to do a non-response to an intrusion. And when clients get to the point where they're able to do this, there's often a lot of excitement about being understood and having language for the first time, especially if they've been to behavioral therapy in the past, which just called them a problem and said, you're overthinking this and this nuance isn't real. You're just being compulsive. You're being avoidant. This is a treatment interfering behavior. And we say, oh no, you're very smart. You were onto something. This can give us so much motivation into working on OCD. I've had this happen over and over and over again where people drop out of inpatient or rather residential programs for OCD, and then they come back to a good conceptualization and are ready to work on it for the first time. That's a powerful thing when it happens. And then lastly, for obsessional doubt, ICBT is an option. Not all OCD, according to the appraisal model at least, is fitting into what ICBT really works on. ICBT works on this doubt about self and senses, and assuming that what I haven't experienced yet is more important than what I'm seeing right now. So leading me to doubt, am I safe? This felt fine, but what if something I just realized is more important than all the experience that I've had to date? Uh, ICBT is really effective for that, and it's going to be non-behavioral, so we don't have to worry so much about those about harming people by assuming that they're going to habituate or something like that, or a fundamental change intent. Further, baked into ICBT is a lot of understanding of the reasoning behind the obsession to begin with. And so, if you're skilled in doing this conceptualization, within some of those early modules of ICBT, you can describe with the client how they got confused in the first place, including those traits. I have a talk on YouTube about that on the ICBT channel if anyone is interested in looking into that further. So, some case studies of ways that I've used this. Well, who was this? Oh, so this is in general. I actually see this happen across a number of clients. Being in the neurominority, we're showing these divergent traits and behaviors, and it leads to some broad rejection. Autistic folks with hyperempathy as a trait can blame themselves for being rejected. I feel empathetic towards the person who seems annoyed by me and say, oh, I caused that. And so they get this confused guilt burdening people when in reality they were the victim of the rejection there. That confused hyperempathy towards people who are rejecting leads to like a hate of essential self. Over and over and over again, getting that invalidation. Why am I such a problem? That hate of essential self would give credence to belief that one could commit all these ego dystonic acts. So obsession is created from belief in that the possibility and compulsion becomes justified. What am I saying there? Yes, obsession is created from the belief that I'm capable of this, and then doing the compulsion of I got to keep myself away from people. I need to do special things to keep myself from doing those harmful acts becomes justified because I'm seeing myself the wrong way. So autism led to hyper empathy, led to shame, led to obsession. This is another really tough client. Um, he's not all the way better. I still work with him, but we definitely made big strides with understanding this piece of catalyzing. So this was a client who had flat affect. They're somewhere on the asexual, aromantic spectrum. They have sexual desire at times, but they've never had romantic desire. In fact, when they were a little kid, they were really baffled by romance in like kids' movies, where they would say, this person is acting out of control or irrationally. Why would they do that? Based off of love? There's plenty of fish in the sea kind of idea. I'm not understanding why someone wouldn't act in their own self-interest when they're overwhelmed by this love of emotion. And it never really made sense to him. Then, in an adolescent time, some factors led to some identity exploration, and they explored some thoughts about some taboo fantasies. And a lot of adolescents explore some thoughts of some taboo things, but they could not tell how they felt about it because of this flat affect and that ace arrow orientation. It was a confusing experience to them, and they couldn't tell if they liked it or not, and they couldn't tell if they liked non-taboo things a lot or not. over time, they connected this to other things that have happened in their past. They associated these taboo fantasies they were having in the moment that were confusing with stories of other people who had given in to desire and people who had taken small actions that ended up putting them on a slippery slope where they eventually gave in to desire and acted against their best interest and lost control, and it led to serious immorality. And I'm talking about people who are like pedophiles or people who are compulsive sexual behavior where they have done compulsive sexual acts that got worse and worse over time by going to the internet and seeing what's available. And this stuff came out of so many things out of his youth. I mean, it came out of Disney movies where the prince charges back into the castle for no reason, as well as coming from seeing a peer in a special ed classroom say, I'm going to have a good day today, but then become overwhelmed and have a meltdown anyway. And combine that all these this is the way the world works with the confusion about what's happening to me right now, and he ends up in that place. So their aromantic orientation made desire and arousal hard to understand. They assume they're capable of losing control as they'd seen others act against their self-interest when desire and emotion is involved. So their belief that they could lose control hinged on their confusion about why they felt uncommon emotional responses to taboo stimuli. Clearing that up was so enlightening. We came up with the word, the internet is a treasure trove of information, uh, qua romantic or quasi romantic, which is on the ace arrow spectrum about feeling like romance is bizarre and you can't imagine why people are into it. Having a word for that and reading other people's explanation of that made so much of this click and helped put into perspective, why am I having these doubts about myself to begin with? That was a cool one. Okay, last case study. Which client was this? Oh, so this is a client who he comes to my office and he says, I'm worried about losing my memory. And he's got all these compulsions that are meant to prevent memories from slipping out of his head and getting lost. And as he's describing things to me, we pick up that he is really visual in his cognition. Every conversation with him is full of metaphors that are complex with visual themes, like I was deep in the woods with my OCD and I was climbing out past the trees, etc., climbing out of a hole, staying above the clouds. And I realize he's doing a lot of visualization when he's thinking about what's going on, why he's feeling his obsessions. So yeah, let's get into that. So he's someone who's a highly visual thinker to begin with. He also has a good long-term memory. Probably a lot of that good long-term memory is related to how much he does rehearsal of things in his head, of these visual things, because he enjoys it. It's a stim that he's doing internally. But he's also had OCD as long as he can remember, often on some health themes. Um, Most recently, before he'd come to me, was related to distress about illness in his late grandparents, where he thought that he maybe had something going on with his health that could be lethal. But by the time he came to me, it was not supposed to be about health. He was doing these repeating compulsions. He's walking back and forth down the hallway, unable to come into my room. He's carrying a beach towel with him, and he has to sit on the beach towel everywhere he goes. So people are thinking that this is about contamination or something else. But we made more sense of it than that. What it turned out to be the function of the beach towel was that he thought if he sat on the cushion, that memories would leak down the back of his head and down his spine and get deposited into the cushion, and he would leave them behind. Then, as he left, he would have to come back and get them from the couch before he could leave, and he would have to do it as many times as he needed to until a not just right experience would go away. So it was still about memory. And it turned out to still be about the health anxiety because his grandfather had dementia and had died a couple of years back, and that was very much wrapped up in it. And also, he had watched a SpongeBob cartoon when he was a kid where SpongeBob opens his head and there's flies that are flying around in there, and some of them fly out. And he got in his mind through all these visualizations that what could be happening is that his memories are leaking out the back of his spine and he's leaving them behind. Understanding that, we could come up with an idea like memories can't be left behind like car keys. You can't lose memories like car keys. They're not physical objects. And seeing how he got there enabled him to believe that and practice non-engagement for the first time, where he'd been saying that he was non-engaging, but the reality was that he was doing a bunch of visualization to try to get things to feel right. Understanding that was incredibly helpful to his progress. So autism leads to hyperphantasia, which leads to very convincing experiences about what might be happening, but they're really just imagined, which leads to obsession. Okay, well, further, in OCD world, we want there's a lot of talk about embrace uncertainty, but our autistic clients often need more reassurance. I want to embrace uncertainty when there's real uncertainty. When it's not real, I want to be able to reassure. So uncertainty is, reassuring people is not a dirty word, and that might run counter to some of what you encounter in the OCD world. In this intersection, particularly as with all psychotherapy, we have to be so mindful of the power dynamic where our client agrees to our conceptualization, but were we leveraging our attachment? Were we leveraging positive regard with someone who has compliance trauma? That's always going to be in the back of our mind as we're trying to conceptualize the learning tasks for this client. And build identity is a parallel process with all of our autistic clients, but it is a powerful tool against OCD as well. We see that Black Americans who have a more well-developed racial identity are less likely to develop OCD. I don't have data from an autistic community, but it makes some common sense. It's a good research question to ask. Is a strong autistic identity also protective against developing all these doubts about self? All right, that's the presentation. I'd save just a couple minutes for some questions, but thanks for listening, and open it up to some questions.
Yeah, this is so